Good morning, economics. Here we are, our first lecture in our remote learning. Yesterday, you finished up some work on demand, and today we are transitioning into supply. So today will be some lecture. We're going to talk about supply for the next 3 units, or lessons, excuse me. Lessons 4, 5, and 6 are all going to deal with supply in various ways. So today we're just as lesson 4, which just focuses on demand itself. Um, as we go forward, right, we're going to continue to have lecture. We're going to continue to have concept checks. We'll continue to have some problem sets, and we'll continue to have quizzes and tests. Hopefully, no more than one test if we get there. In this time period, because hopefully we'll be back in the classroom relatively soon. I encourage you to go ahead and post questions in the discussion. I know yesterday I was a little tardy in responding. I plan to be better, and for you to get for the turnaround time to those questions to be quicker. One of the questions that I got was, how do you determine total revenue? How do you determine elasticity? Some of you are trying to use the percent change formula, which should work, but those problems were designed for you to use the total revenue test to determine elasticity. And the total revenue test, right, is simply determining what the price change is. So if it's up or down, if it's an increase in price or a decrease in price, and then what the total revenue change is, if total revenue goes up or down. And depending on what that relationship is, it's either going to be elastic, inelastic, or unit elastic. And you can check that in the last slide. There's a table in the last slide of lesson 3's lecture. So check that out. I explained that in the discussion board in response to some of the questions posted there. And hopefully you guys got that. The other question that was raised was, where do you get, and this was raised by several, where do you find the quantity demanded for the second set of problems about the bumper stickers? And the answer is the quantity demanded at each price is in the paragraphs above the table. So you got to read that whole thing, read it carefully, find those quantity demands, put them in that table, then you can calculate total revenue and determine elasticity. All right, so here we go. Supply. So to introduce supply, I just want to talk about corn real quick, right? So corn is a product that was native to the Americas when Europeans, Columbus, arrived. It was a food staple of Native American diet, and they were growing it. So there was a certain supply provided of corn in North America at that time. But as we have moved forward throughout history from 1492 right to today in 2020, production of corn, the supply of corn has increased greatly. And that is because we find more uses for it, which means that there is increasing demand for it. And in response, farmers produce more corn. They grow more corn to meet that demand. And we'll get how supply and demand interact with each other a little bit later. But that's basically what we're looking at here. So if we think about corn, right, some uses are food, like popcorn, right? That's a very basic one. That's one of the earliest uses of corn. Feeding it to cattle and pigs as animal feed is something that happens after Columbus comes to the Americas, after contact with Europe, after the Columbian Exchange, because cows and pigs are European. There were none in the Americas. But when they are introduced to the Americas, they need a high caloric food, and corn ends up being perfect for that. And so even today, we use corn to feed our cattle and pigs in the beef and pork industry for beef and pork. A more recent development in corn is extracting ethanol from it, or creating ethanol from corn. And we use ethanol a variety of things. Two growing areas that we use ethanol is as a fuel additive to gasoline. And you can always check your gas pump and see how much ethanol has been added to that gallon of gasoline that you're purchasing. And even we have some vehicles operating 100% on ethanol. So it has become a fuel in and of itself. So in the United States, corn is extremely important. There is a very large quantity supplied of corn in the United States. And another way we can see that is because every state, except for Hawaii and Alaska, grows corn commercially. So if we were to look at the supply of corn, we would see that it has increased greatly over time, and in particular, there is a huge jump between 2005 and 2008. So the question is, what happens to the supply of corn, or what happened to the supply of corn when the price rose, and in this case, from $2 a bushel in 2005 to $6 a bushel in 2008? Well, the answer is quite simple. Corn supplied increased, right? Farmers, commercial farmers, if they're growing multiple crops, corn, wheat, barley, soybeans, they cut back on the wheat, the soybeans, the barley. They don't plant as much of that on their land, and they plant more corn because the price has gone up for corn and they want to supply more corn, right? Others may start planting corn in fields that were not being used for anything, right? Maybe it's a field for grazing for cattle. Maybe it's just an empty field that they weren't doing, and so new land is put into the production of corn and therefore supplying more corn. Farmers also turn to science, to technology, to what we talked about as capital, right? New tools and methods of growing corn. So new varieties of seed, hardier seed, fertilizers, and insecticides. More of these are used as well to increase the supply of corn that farmers are providing the market. So all of these took place. And these are all ways that price, supply, and other factors interact and determine the overall supply of a good or service. And so in the next 3 lessons, we're going to look at that. We're going to start with just the relationship between price and quantity supplied, and then we'll get into some other things that impact supply. So if we think about the bottom line here, what we are going to learn over the next couple of lessons, we just need to remember, right, that the bottom line is firms strive to make as much profit as possible. Those farmers, the reason they take land out of wheat production, out of soybean production, out of barley production, and turn it into corn is because they are looking for, at the higher price, they are hoping, usually, and they are usually going to get it, a higher profit. And we'll talk about profit a little bit more in a couple slides. So to achieve a higher profit, as much profit as possible, they adjust the quantity of the good or service they produce in response to the changes in either the price at which it can be sold or the cost of producing it. And we'll get into the cost of producing things in a little bit. But notice it could go down, right? If the price fell, like it did relative to corn for something like wheat, right? They're going to produce less of wheat because the price fell relative to corn as the price of corn rose. So we got to think of those things. But that's the bottom line. That's the key idea here for all 3 lessons. All right, so lesson 4 is about, understanding supply, the basics of supply, just like we started with the basics of demand before we started to add some extra things to it. So producers respond to price changes, offering more goods for sale when prices increase and fewer goods when prices decrease. And an excellent example of this, key idea for lesson 4, is coffee. A while back when I was in high school, Starbucks was around, but it was just starting. And so the idea of fancy, expensive $5, $6 for a cup of coffee, and that you could get coffee and things other than just coffee and maybe some sugar and a little bit of creamer, right? But things like lattes, and I don't drink coffee, as you know, so I don't know all the terms, but lattes and cappuccinos and frappuccinos, etc., all these things, there was a very small supply of them. But as the price rose and as people were paying that price, right? So the price of a cup of coffee may have remained and remains relatively small at $1 or so, right? The price of those other coffee-based drinks, those prices have risen. And so as those prices have risen, the total supply for fancy coffee has increased. Starbucks kind of the leader, but then we have a whole bunch of other coffee businesses, right? Restaurants or baristas, whatever they're called. Yeah, that's the wrong word. But anyways, we have a whole bunch of them, right? Whether it's Dutch Bro or Pete's or Coffee Bean or Gimme Coffee. There's Caribou Coffee. There's a whole bunch throughout the United States, right? And even places that traditionally offer that really cheap coffee, like a McDonald's, a Dunkin' Donuts, right? Or maybe even a 7-Eleven. I don't know that 7-Eleven has gotten into the fancy coffees, but certainly McDonald's and Dunkin' Donuts has gotten into the fancy coffee, and they offer coffees or coffee type drinks, right, that can run around $5 or $6 for a drink. And so we see this law, and this is the law of supply, in effect there. As the price rose, right, the supply of fancy coffees, whether it was just simply the number of Starbucks, right, in the area or other firms getting into that industry to offer fancy coffees, they supplied more fancy coffees. So we can see that, and this is the basic idea that we're going to be dealing with in this lesson. Okay, so we mentioned profit, right? Firms want to maximize profit. They want to increase profit at every opportunity that presents itself. And the two main ways they do that is the price can rise, right? And therefore they'll supply more. And that will result in, if the demand matches supply, in increased total revenue. The other thing they can do is they can change the cost of producing the good to help increase profit. And so profit, as we think about it, is the total revenue a firm receives from selling its product minus the total cost of producing it. We got to remember that profit is after we pay the cost. Sometimes students forget that profit is after paying costs, and so they confuse profit for total revenue. Total revenue is not profit. Some companies have a total revenue that's very high, but because their costs are very high, their profit is very low, right? So if we think about something like your snack shop, right? If you sell your cup of ramen for $1, but it costs you 95 cents, right? You're not going to have a lot of profit. You have a profit of 5 cents. But if per cup of ramen, but if the cost for the cup of ramen is, let's say, 25 cents and you're selling it for $1, then your profit is 75 cents per cup of ramen, right? And so that's that relationship. So if you couldn't reduce the cost of producing that cup of ramen anymore, and let's go with the 95 cents for a cup of ramen, right? So that's stuck. You can't change the cost of producing that cup of ramen because that's what it costs you to get from whoever you're getting it, Costco, whatever, right? So instead, you could raise the price. And then hopefully your total revenue, as long as demand matched that quantity supplied and that price change, as long as demand was willing to go to that price, you would have a total revenue that was higher, and hopefully your profit would be a little larger. So when we think about this, when we think about profit, profit's going to help dictate the quantity supplied, right, at a given time. And so quantity supplied, as we think about that in economics, is very similar to quantity demanded. It is the amount, quantity supplied is the amount of a good that firms are willing to supply at a particular price over a given period of time. So as I think about how much are we willing to supply at, let's say, $1, right, for your snack shop, that is going to help you determine how much ramen you're going to have on hand. And ideally, you will, right, sell what you plan to sell for that day at that price. So there's that willingness, right, like we had with quantity demanded, and there's that particular price at a particular time. Key components for both quantity supplied and quantity demanded, right? And we've already mentioned the law of supply. That was on the previous slide, but to go over it one more time, According to the law of supply, an increase in the price of a good leads to an increase in the quantity supplied. And I should note, although it's not written here on our slide, that the opposite is true. A decrease in the price of a good leads to a decrease in the quantity supplied. This, of course, is a general statement, just like our law of demand was a general statement, because there can be other factors that impact supply. Notice I didn't say quantity supplied. I said supply, right? Just like there can be other factors that impact demand. When we were talking about demand, I made it very clear that price and quantity demanded were connected, and those are the only things, right? Price was the only thing that could change quantity demanded, or reversely, a change in quantity demanded will always result in a change of price. Same here with the law of supply. Price and quantity supplied are tied together. However, supply, as we will see in a little bit, right, there can be other factors on supply. And so lastly, this means that just like with the law of demand, when we're talking about the law of supply, we are assuming these other factors are not taking place. The only change is price when we're talking about the law of supply. So all other things like adding more land or new technologies for producing a good, these are not changing. The only change is price. If we were to draw it out, we would get something, a supply curve that looks like this, right? The first thing I want to point out is the supply curve goes in the opposite direction of our demand curve. Our demand curve was a downward slope, right, or a negative slope, and our supply curve is an upward slope from 0 or a positive slope. And this is important, right? And supply curves will always go this way. So if we think about the law of supply, again, we can see this now visually on this supply curve. As the price rises, so if our price here is $2, let's say it's $2 for a bottle of water, right? So at $2 for a bottle of water, we have, here's our price, $2, we have a quantity demanded of 20, let's say bottles, right? And that's where we are. If the price were to increase, let's say it went to $3, right? Our quantity demanded would increase to 30 right there. And so at $3, we would provide, after we thought about it and did our calculations about cost, production, and stuff like that, the cost of production, things like that, we would determine that we would be willing to supply 30 bottles of water at $3 a bottle, whereas we were only willing to provide 20 or supply 20 bottles of water at $2. And we can see that the opposite is true, right, if price were to fall. I'm choosing a different color here. Let's see here. I used purple. Let's use, well, we're going to use red here. I know I used red for that center one, but right, if the price were to fall, oh, this is an orange. That's fine. Right, if price were to fall to $1, right, we would end up here on the demand curve because we would actually go down like this, right? And that would be 10. So at $1, we may be saying to ourselves, it's not really worth a lot to put a lot of effort into bottling water when it's only $1 a bottle for the price, right? We may be only making 3 cents on the bottle, so we're not going to do that. Whereas at $2, we may be making 75 cents, and at $3, we may be making $1.10. Right? And that's why we would be willing to provide or supply more bottles of water at $3, is because we probably would, if we did the math, find out, excuse me, that our profits were greater at that price point. And so we're willing to provide more. All right. I think that hopefully that illustrates on a graph what we're talking about when we're talking about the law. Just like with demand, we will generate a supply schedule for supply, and we're going to list, again, we're going to list our price in one column and our quantity supplied in the other column, right? This happens to be a one supply schedule for General Gasoline, right? And we can see that General Gasoline, this gasoline station, is willing to provide 0 gallons at $1.50 a gallon. Probably means we could guess, and we'll see how this would work and why it might be 0, but we could guess just right now. The reason for that is they probably aren't going to make any money. Maybe the gasoline costs them $1.50, and so they aren't going to make, their profits are going to be 0. So they're not going to be interested in doing that. That would be a waste of time for them. But at $2, they're willing to supply 5,000 gallons. Perhaps that's a day, right? And at $2.50, 10,000 gallons. At $3, 15,000 gallons. And at $3.50, $20,000 gallons of gasoline. This should be, I'm going to go through this quickly because this is very similar to the demand schedule. This just happens to be supply. Again, I want to point out, right, that as the price increases, so does quantity supplied. And remember, with demand, as the price increased, the quantity demanded actually decreased. That's going to be the only significant change here between a supply schedule and a demand schedule. So if we were to plot those points, similar to that previous supply curve that we had, right? If we were to plot these points for General Gasoline, we would end up with a supply curve that looks something like this. And a supply curve is the graphical representation of the supply schedule, showing the quantity the firm will supply at each price. And so here we have our 0 quantity supplied, because at $1.50, the gas station is not even going to open and provide gas. At $2, right, we're providing 5,000 gallons of gas. At $2.50, we're providing 10,000 gallons of gas. At $3, we're providing 15,000 gallons of gas. And at $3.50, we're providing 20,000 gallons of gas. All right, and so the other couple things to point out here on the supply curve is that just like with the demand curve, notice, change color here, notice that we always have price on the y-axis, and we always have quantity demanded, usually labeled as quantity of the product, not just quantity demanded, but quantity of the product down here on the x-axis. The other thing I just want to point out is, just like with demand, for our first supply curves, just like our first demand curves, we're going to use a straight line. Our data is going to always end up probably giving us a straight line, but it is possible, in fact, in the real world, it's very likely that our demand curve will be curved and not a straight line like we see here. So just like with demand, we can also generate a market supply curve and a market supply schedule for a particular product. And that's when we're going to take multiple firms that are providing or supplying that good or service. We're going to add them together to get our market quantity supplied. Remember, with demand, we did the same thing. We took the quantity of gasoline demanded by, I believe it was Alice, and then Fred was also purchasing gas, right? He was also demanding gas. He had the willingness and the ability to buy gas at a particular price. And so when we took those demand schedules for the individuals, Alice and Fred, and put them together, we got what we called a market quantity demand. And we're going to do the same thing here with supply. We're going to take different firms. This time we're going to keep with General Gasoline. Right now we're going to know that, as is usually the case, across the corner from on that intersection is National Gasoline. And they are going to be providing or supplying gasoline as well. So if we look at our supply schedule here, right, we've already looked at General Gasoline. We've already seen what that supply curve looks like. And now we're going to note, sorry, I moved my camera. Now we're going to note, right, that we have National Gasoline here as well. And they, like General Gasoline, they're not providing any gas at $1.50. But they are willing to provide gas at $2. And in this case, they're willing to provide 6,000 gallons of gasoline at $2. And they are willing, therefore, at the next price increase, to provide 12,000 gallons at $2.50, 18,000 at $3, and 24,000 gallons at $3.50. So we take those together and we simply add them. So I'm going to erase this real quick. Right, and we can note that when we add these together, we get, we get our market. This is pretty exciting here. We get our market quantity supplied. We just simply add the quantity supplied of each individual firm to get that market quantity supplied. And then, of course, we can graph it. And so here we can see again, right, how this works. We take the individual supply curve for General Gasoline, right, and we take those values. We have an individual supply curve for National Gasoline. Notice, right, that the line is a little flatter here for National Gasoline compared to General Gasoline, and we'll talk about that when we get to elasticity. We should already be thinking, how flat or how steep is the curve? That's going to tell me about elasticity. We're going to get to that in a little bit. But we can see that, right, that there's a little difference there. And when we simply add them together, we get an equal sign, and we get our market supply curve, which is right here, where we've plotted the quantity supplied at each price point for all the firms providing gasoline. As we're talking about market supply, we need to note that there is something that happens in supply that we didn't have to deal with in demand. So as we're thinking about this relationship between a supply schedule and supply curve, and the fact that we can have individual supply curves and schedules and market supply curves and schedules, we need to note that there can be a difference in the market supply curve when we have perfect competition as compared to monopoly. So when we have a monopoly, there are no other firms providing that good or service. And so really, there can be very little change in product or good or service supplied, because there aren't any other firms competing with that firm also trying to provide the same good or service. But in perfect competition, which is what we'll be discussing and using as a model here, we're assuming perfect competition instead of one in a monopoly. And we'll get to monopolies later, much later. Excuse me. We're going to see the law of supply in effect. We're going to see this relationship that we've discussed. This is all assuming perfect competition. So what do we mean by perfect competition? Well, in perfect competition, a market, we have perfect competition in a market when every unit of the goods sold in the market is identical, regardless of which firm is selling it. Now, we should note that this rarely takes place because in manufactured goods, firms try to differentiate their product, even if they are almost identical, right? Like Pepsi and Coca-Cola, there are some differences, whether it's simply branding or a slight difference in taste, right? But we mean in our model here by perfect competition is the product, the good, is identical regardless of which firm is selling it. A very simple example of this would be something like strawberries or oranges, right? You go to the farmer's market, there's really not going to be any difference between the oranges you buy from farmer A or farmer B. They may try to get you to believe that there's a difference, but probably there is no difference. So something like that would fall into this category. Secondly, the good is produced by many firms none of which is large enough to influence the price of the good. So in a monopoly, a single firm provides the good or service, and they can influence the price outside of these market factors, both demand and supply. But in perfect competition, there is no firm large enough to influence the price. And so we're talking about identical products, a whole bunch of very small firms, small enough that they don't influence the price. Third, new firms that want to supply the good are free to enter the market. That means that there are no barriers to entry, right? It is easy, relatively easy to get into providing that good or service in the market. And remember, a market is simply anywhere where a buyer and a seller, a consumer and a firm or business come together and exchange goods and services. So when a firm wants to get into a particular market, they want to bring this good, right, to the market. In perfect competition, it's going to be free. There are going to be no barriers to that company doing that. It's going to be easy and simple and straightforward to do it. This could be regulations, governments, right? A situation in which they are not free to enter the market might be because of regulations. Governments are regulating the industry, or perhaps there is a lot of capital needed to get into the industry, right? If we think about an example for us, it would be fairly easy for one of us in class to start perhaps a bakery. There's not a lot needed to start a bakery. We could start baking bread and start selling it. Yeah, we need to know how to bake bread and a couple things like that, but that is relatively easy compared to perhaps one of us wanting to get into the cell phone, the smartphone market, and start manufacturing and then selling smartphones. I'm not talking about retail, I'm talking about manufacturing and then selling smartphones. A lot more difficult, probably because we need a lot more capital than we would need to start a small bakery, etc. Right? And then, of course, on the flip side, firms are free to exit the market and stop supplying without any barriers to the exit. All right, and our fourth component to perfect competition in a market is that consumers are aware of the price charged by the various firms and have the opportunity to buy from whichever firm they choose. So sometimes in a market, although you are aware of another firm offering that product, you cannot get to that market where that firm is offering that good or service. And secondly, consumers are not always aware of the price charged by the various firms. So if you only know what one firm is charging for its product, but not the other firm, it's going to be hard for you to make a decision, and we're going to consider that to be something other than perfect competition in a market. We're going to talk about these a little bit more. We'll leave it at that. All right. So lastly, a couple examples where we have something that comes close to perfect competition. Again, perfect competition is very difficult to achieve and see in the real world. This is really more of a model for us and how we base some of our other models and laws, like the law of supply, on the assumption that there is perfect competition. But in the real world, some things that come very close to perfect competition are those agricultural products, like I mentioned, oranges, or perhaps soybeans, corn, like we started this lecture with, wheat, cotton, etc. And that's because there are usually enough firms, none of them large enough to influence the price on their own. The product is identical. It's relatively easy for firms to get in and out of producing these products, and consumers are generally aware of the price charged by the various firms and have an opportunity to buy from a large variety of firms. So the last thing we're going to consider in this lesson is elasticity, right? We want to be able to identify the factors that cause the quantity supplied to be more or less responsive to price changes. And here we're talking about the same concept that we just ended with demand, and we spent some time on. how sensitive is how sensitive is quantity supplied to a change in price? And so we're going to use the same formula, right? Percentage change in quantity supplied divided by the percentage change in price to come up with the value. This is one way. Remember, we ended up with two ways in demand to determine elasticity. This way with a percent change formula, and then we also use total revenue. Here in elasticity of supply, again, we're going to start with this percent change formula to determine that, to determine elasticity. So when the quantity supplied changes by a smaller percentage than the price, the elasticity of supply is less than 1, right? Our value is going to be less than 1, and therefore supply is considered inelastic, right? So we can have a large change and a relatively small change in quantity supplied. Let me say that again. We can have a large change in the price and a relatively small change in quantity supplied. We're going to have inelastic demand. As with elasticity of demand, we can have extreme cases, right? And so in the most extreme case of inelastic supply, we would end up with a vertical supply curve, which has a supply elasticity of 0. And we would consider that perfectly inelastic, right? And basically that means that we could have any price and there would be no change in quantity supplied. We also have, right? And so we also have elastic supply, and again that's going to be if our value is greater than 1.0. So when the quantity supplied changes by a larger percentage than the price, the elasticity of supply is greater than 1, and we consider that elastic. So again, we could have perhaps a 50-cent change, right? Not a 50-cent change, sorry, something like a 10% change in price, and we might have a 50% change in quantity supplied. That we would consider elastic. And just like with inelastic, we can have extreme cases of elastic supply. This is going to give us a horizontal supply curve in which we have an infinite supply elasticity, and we have, again, a horizontal supply curve. And lastly, just like with elasticity of demand, we can have unit elastic in supply. Supply can be unit elastic. And this is if we have a moderate sensitivity to price changes. We're going to have a value that is exactly 1.0 when we do our calculation of percent change divided by price change. And if we get that exact number of 1.0, we know that if we have a 10% change in price, we're going to also have a 10% change in quantity supplied. That is a 1-to-1 ratio, therefore 1.0, and we consider that unit elastic. Here we can see what these might look like, right? We can see with inelastic supply here, right, that our supply curve is pretty steep. It is closer to vertical than it is to horizontal. So that would be a visual clue. It's not 100%, but that would be a visual clue that we are probably looking at inelastic demand. Again, because a change in price, for instance, going from $10 to $15, we only went from 100 pizzas to 125 is what that number is supposed to be, right? Not a great increase in quantity supplied. Looking here at elastic supply, we can see that our supply curve is probably a little closer to lying flat or being horizontal. Again, visual clue, not guaranteed, but visual clue that we are probably looking at a elastic supply curve. And more importantly, we can see, right, that when our price went from 10 to 15 in this particular case, quantity of pizzas supplied went from 100 to 200. A much greater change in quantity supplied in that price change than we had back with our inelastic supply example. Or if we had unit elastic supply, notice we have an exact change, or our percent changes are exactly the same. We have a 1-to-1 ratio. We go from 100 to 150 as we move from $10 to $15 in this. And this is unit elastic supply. So to conclude, almost conclude, we have one more slide after this. I have this table here, right, that breaks this down. This is a great reference, like you needed to refer to for your homework, or sorry, for your concept check for the last lesson. This is a great table to check elasticity, particularly when we are using the formula, which is the only thing we're going to be looking at here for supply. We're just going to be looking at this formula here. At least for now, to determine elasticity. So again, right, elastic means that supply is very sensitive to a price change. Unit elastic means that supply is moderately sensitive to a price change, and the percent change equals the percent change in quantity supplied equals the percent change in price. And for inelastic supply, supply is not very sensitive to price changes. So what determines elasticity of supply? Why might some product, right, why might the elasticity of supply of one product be elastic and for another product be inelastic? And there are two main reasons that we're going to cover here at the end of our lecture. The first one is production costs. So some items, some goods and services can be costly to produce, and the more costly a good or services to produce and supply, the more inelastic supply will be for that product. So for example, the supply of gold is relatively inelastic compared to other products. It is difficult to get more gold. It is not easy for firms to get more gold. And so the supply of gold is inelastic. Even if there are a large change in the price of gold, it's going to be difficult for those firms, those large mining firms, to extract a significant amount of gold out of the mines in response to that change in price. Versus if we were to compare gold with something like t-shirts, right, a printed basic t-shirt, t-shirts are going to be elastic, right? Supply is going to be elastic for t-shirts. It's going to be, firms are going to jump in and provide more t-shirts. If the price of a t-shirt jumped just 10%, we would see a large change in the supply of t-shirts. And that's because it is relatively cheap to produce them. There are tons of firms that have the equipment needed to produce t-shirts. Cotton is relatively easily available around the world, and the main countries that make our t-shirts, that weave them and even print them, like in India and Sri Lanka and Mexico, etc., they have easy access to cotton. They have easy access to the equipment needed. The equipment is relatively inexpensive, and so it's easy and relatively cheap to increase supply because the production cost for t-shirts is fairly low. So that's one, production costs. So if it's difficult, if it's expensive to produce, supply is probably going to be inelastic. If it is easy to produce and cheap to produce more of the product, then supply will be elastic. The other determinant is time. Right, even in factories that can make a shift, it's going to take them time to shift their resources from producing good A to good B, if good B is the good that had the price increase. And so we find out that in the short term, generally, supply is inelastic for a product in the short term. But as firms have time to retrain their workers, perhaps, change some equipment around to produce the other good that experienced a price increase, we find that it becomes more elastic as we have more time, as firms are able to make those changes and increase supply of that good. So again, what determines the elasticity of supply? The two main determinants, the ones that we are focusing on here, are production costs and time. And so we have a little graphic to help explain that. So here we just see, right, inelastic supply, quantity supplied is less responsive to price changes. Usually when there's a short time horizon, right, if we were to wake up tomorrow and find out that t-shirts had increased by 25%, we wouldn't find that tomorrow there would also have been a 50% increase in the number of t-shirts available, but in a relatively short time that would happen. Or sorry, in a relatively longer period of time, we would find that elasticity, right, that the number supplied, the number of t-shirts supplied had grown percentage-wise greater than the price change. So inelastic supply, the two determinants, short time horizon and additional output is much more costly to produce. So it's really costly to produce more. That results in inelastic supply. And then for elastic supply, right, the longer time we have, the more elastic we find supply to be. And if the additional output, that is that additional product, is not much more costly to produce, we find that supply is elastic there. And then of course, right in the middle, unit elastic supply, that is they remain, the percent change in quantity supplied is the same as the percent change in price. And that's just right in the middle. That's kind of our buffer zone there. All right, that is the end of our discussion, our introduction to supply. We covered a lot more in this lecture than we did with demand, right? We covered elasticity, we covered some determinants of elasticity, we covered the basic ideas. We talked about supply schedules, supply curves, market supply schedules, market supply curves, etc. But hopefully our time in which we went a little slower through demand has helped you follow along the concepts here with supply, because really it is the same mechanisms working here. We're just thinking up in terms of firm and supplying that good or service rather than with demand. We were thinking again as a consumer purchasing that good or service. All right, there'll be a concept check for you to work through. There will be a discussion board to ask questions. And at the beginning of our next lecture, I will go over the answers to the concept check just to make sure that we're all on board and we're understanding what's taking place. Have a great day.